Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. It's kind of AI week here again. We're doing a bit of counter programming as the Republic, as the fire starters are getting going on the Republic. We're going another way, and so we did, as one does during moments of international high stakes, intrigue, and crisis, podcast on the Jewish tradition and artificial intelligence. And so keeping up in that grand tradition of not talking about what everybody is talking about, we have my friend and colleague, Christopher Scalia, senior fellow at AI, a fellow minion in the subterranean shovel-fighting gladiatorial arenas working underneath Yuval Levin. And he's got a new book coming out called 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love, but probably haven't read. Chris, welcome back to The Remnant. Oh, he's also the host of a new podcast called Back of the Book, which talks about, like, culture stuff and, like, serious culture stuff and pop culture stuff and, like, you know, and obscure culture stuff and culture stuff. So there you go. Chris, welcome back.
Thank you, Jonah. Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
All right. We're going to come back to tradition, which I broke only once because of the esoterica of the golem and the Dybbuk and its relationship to artificial intelligence. And we're going to come back to the standard first question. What's your book about?
My book is about, well, it's all in the title, Jonah.
It is pretty self-explanatory, I got to say. It's better than a lot of books where you don't have to ask the follow-up question. But expand.
I was tempted to add, and why they matter, because it's not really a book title unless you have and why it matters in there. But the premise of the book is that when you talk to conservatives about fiction, if you talk to conservatives about fiction, the conversations tend to revolve around the same handful of novels. So maybe if you're hanging out with trad Catholics who wear tweed, like I do a lot of the time, that is, hang out with those Catholics, not necessarily wear tweed. They'll talk about Brideshead Revisited, or they'll talk about the Lord of the Rings trilogy, or something by Ayn Rand, etc. Of course, Bonfire of the Vanities.
Hey, trad Caths talk about Rand?
No, sorry, not trad. Trad Cats will talk about Waugh. But libertarians will talk about Rand.
Okay, because I was going to say, your trad cats and my trad cats, those Venn diagrams don't overlap very much.
That's right. No, sorry for the confusion there. But different types of conservatives like different kinds of books, but they tend to be the same handful of books circulating among them. This book is an attempt to basically, as academics would say, broaden the canon a little bit, or restock the conservative bookshelf by saying, not that there's anything wrong with most of the books I just mentioned. I like most of them. But it kind of does conservatism a disservice by limiting our bookshelf in that way, and obscuring other great novels that engage with conservative ideas and represent conservative characters in thoughtful and interesting ways.
So we should just, for the audience's sake, let people know that you're actually a former, like, real English professor who taught 18th and 19th century literature and then escaped the think tank world.
That's right.
And then you ran academic programs here at AI for a long time, still finding empty bottles around from those days. But anyway, look, I agree with you. I just want to be very ginger in this criticism because it applies to me. And therefore, one must be nuanced rather than sweeping in any criticism that also applies to me. No, but there is a tendency among conservatives to talk about how great the canon is.
Yeah.
Whatever they mean by the canon, that's fine. But they haven't read much of the canon.
Yeah.
And so, like, I can talk a lot about the canon, and I'm okay with, not compared to Yuval, right? But, like, I'm okay on political philosophy canon. I've dipped in enough that I feel like I can talk that way. But I can't with the serious literature stuff. I mean, I'm very hit or miss. John Podhoretz can talk about the canon.
Yes.
He's he has read everything. I have not read everything, and I feel guilty about it. I still want it to be taught.
Yeah.
So why don't so before we get to the different authors, because I got to say I was you shamed me a little bit for my ignorance of many, not all, but many of the 13 books that you go through. Um, um, do you? How much of a failing do you think that is? Right, that like for the people who talk about the canon, is it just sort of like, is it all posturing? Is it better to talk about the canon and not have read it than to not even know that there is a canon? Right, because like
Yeah.
I guarantee you, there are a lot of goobers, in Magalan who canon what canon? They don't even,
Yeah.
they don't care, right? Is it better to care and be ignorant of it, or how do you think through that stuff?
Well, first of all, your reaction to the book list is I hope shame isn't the right response, but being
Self harm.
perfect. Uh, being unfamiliar with most of the works is exactly what I was going for. Even if you've heard of most of the writers, like
Sure.
for example, I include a George Eliot novel, but it's Middlemarch, which is the one most people have. Sorry, it's not Middlemarch.
Right.
Middlemarch is the one most people have heard of. I include instead Daniel Deronda, partly because I'm not there. The book isn't to remind people to read books they've been told to read a million times before. So, for example, I don't include any Jane Austen because I like Jane Austen, but I don't think anybody needs to be told anymore to read Jane Austen.
Right.
And in fact, I think if anything, people read too much Jane Austen, and they kind of forget that there are a lot of other great writers of her time period.
The Austen people are coming for you.
I know, and they are a formidable group. But that's my favorite hot take. But I think the I will say nothing bad about the canon. I think the canon is an important thing, and I don't think it's a static thing necessarily. I think it's I think conservatives should be open to the idea that there are great works that are not part of the canon, simply because it's impossible to include all of the great works ever written in the canon. And some great works just are, they may be popular at the time, but then they fall out of favor for whatever reasons, or they're just there are two examples in my book that I think could fall in this category. One is Waverley by Walter Scott. Walter Scott is my favorite writer. He was the most famous and popular writer of the Romantic period, much more popular than Jane Austen for at least a century, until he fell out of favor and Austen's status rose. It's not that the people knew Austen was great at the time, but she was just not seen as great as Walter Scott. And there are all sorts of reasons that Walter Scott fell out of favor, but his novels are still great. But I don't think they're considered part of the canon anymore. For example, you look at St. John's college reading list, their list of all the great books their students read. There's no Walter Scott on there. I think there's at least one Austen novel. And so that Walter Scott's novels are still great. They are less accessible in some ways than Jane Austen, but I think in other ways much more relevant to our times than Jane Austen. On the other hand, you have something like another novel I include here, Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, which did fairly well at the time, but she died penniless and kind of out of favor with the literati, and was not rediscovered until the 1970s. And when she was rediscovered, it was kind of as a voice of Black feminism.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that in some ways that might be the most surprising book I include, because that's the people who have read Their Eyes Were Watching God have probably read it in that context.
Is that how she saw herself? I mean,
no. And that's the fascinating thing about her and why I include her. She was conservative.
yeah.
She was really kind of harshly criticized by people like Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison, people whose reputations endured more consistently than hers, for basically being a minstrel writer, a Black woman writing for white people. And so the New York Times columnist and linguistic professor John McWhorter has written a lot about Hurston, saying basically she's America's favorite black conservative. And Their Eyes Were Watching God has some pretty conservative moments, but her nonfiction is especially conservative. Like, she thought Brown v. Board was a terrible decision, which I don't. It's ironic that she hated the decision at the time, not really for constitutional reasons, but for reasons that progressives have since picked up, which is that the argument is basically black people can't be smart unless they're surrounded by white people. And she thought that was a very stupid way to approach education and the understanding of African Americans. But that she's an example of somebody who I think conservatives are kind of instinctively wary of, because she rose to prominence as under the umbrella of black feminism. But in fact, a thoughtful conservative reading of her is much more, to use the word you used again earlier, nuanced or hospitable or friendly to conservative ideas.
So, I used to spend a lot more time on this debate than I have in recent years. But it never really goes away either, which is, can you write great literature intending it to have a political, ideological bent to it? I think one of the problems I have is, or one of the problems I think with that debate is that the left says absolutely when it's left-wing stuff.
Yeah.
And then they say absolutely not when it's conservative stuff. And it seems to me it's absolutely true that it makes it harder, both on the left and right, to not be didactic or propagandistic or allegorical or whatever. But it's not impossible. But I think it's better when the conservatism naturally emanates from the larger human issues involved. How do you think about that?
That's how I think about it too. The novels I include here, I think, would be considered great literature by virtually anybody, whatever the political persuasion, in large part because they don't proselytize. Very often they have pretty clear ideas, but they are first and foremost great works of literature. They have complex characters. The writing is exceptional. They have vivid scenes, compelling imagery, the sorts of things you would expect from great literature. I think the last guest on my podcast, to the back of the book, was a woman named Megan Gafford, who makes the distinction, I think this is helpful, between political art and fanatical art.
Mm-hmm.
Fanatical art is just disregards anything that doesn't support the message. In most of the works I include here, I think there are valid counter arguments within the novel that challenge some of the conservatism within the novel. So, one example is I write about Evelyn Waugh's great satire of journalism, Scoop, and it pretty effectively and famously makes fun of the media for just the groupthink basically that goes on in a foreign press corps. But there are some things about it that aren't necessarily conservative, like these colonizing European nations are completely inept. They don't know what they're doing. And he kind of subtly challenges the assumed moral supremacy of the European characters by having some of their vices mimic the vices and uncivilized behavior of the Africans he depicts there. So I think all of these novels they're not really didactic insofar as they don't toe a party line the entire time. There are multiple ways. I think with most great literature, these novels are open to multiple interpretations and even competing interpretations, not infinite interpretations. I mean, I think there is such a thing as a wrong way to interpret a novel, but these are complex and sophisticated novels, so they're open to competing interpretations and readings.
Yeah, I was just listening to the very depressing, not family listening series on the rest is history about the Belgian Congo,
Hmm.
and they did a special sort of bonus episode just on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which is
Yeah.
so central to all that. And Dominic Sandbrook, the modern historian on there, he had an aside there that I agree with because I've read Hearts of Darkness a long time ago, but
Yeah.
that Conrad is one of these guys that you can cite as an example of a fundamentally conservative author. When people say, "Oh, conservatives can't be produce great literature," and I've always found, look, I'm I'm so down on Russia for the last couple of years for obvious reasons. Um, Russian literature is conservative,
Yes.
in a very tragic and very sort of un-American kind of way. But it's and I don't mean that as the un-American part. I don't mean pejoratively. I just mean like
Yeah.
America is a much more open to the future. Not everything is bleak blizzards and
Right.
and loved ones dying in cells or anything. And but it's not progressive literature,
Yeah.
right? And it's still great literature.
I should say I do not include any Russian novels, and not out of protest for Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but just because I focus on English language originals only. Otherwise, it just would have been impossible to select these only 13 novels. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Um, uh, Dostoevsky is, I think, especially beloved by conservatives,
Mm-hmm.
um, and uh, Gary Saul Morson writes about him particularly well, frequently in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. But I'm thinking of, I don't include any Conrad. I have an appendix that lists books for further reading. If you like the books I write about, then you should read these books. And I include Conrad's Under Western Eyes.
Mm-hmm.
V.S. Naipaul, I do include, and his novel A Bend in the River is deeply informed by Heart of Darkness. And it is not a brief for colonialism.
Right.
But it's also very much a brief against post-colonialism, against the assumption that everything the West brought was bad, and once you throw it out, we'll have these utopian independent nations. And what Naipaul shows is that, well, to use the title of another famous novel, things fall apart, and that these new governments are, like many idealized or utopias, cannot live up to the expectations and are unstable and represent really the thin barrier separating civilization from violence. And that's,
So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's one of the reasons Naipaul is especially relevant in a post October 7th world. Naipaul won the Nobel Prize in Literature after 9/11, and I think the reason was 9/11 reminded everybody that the savagery he was writing about and had been drawing attention to for decades was a real thing, and he was right to take it seriously, and that made his novels especially relevant. And I think that holds true now.
We should back up. What do you mean by conservatism, right? Because like there are many rooms in the mansion of conservatism, and not all definitions coexist equally with others. Is there a thing that is definitionally or distinctly literary conservatism that is different than other kinds of conservatism?
I think literary conservatism implies a respect for literary traditions, and forms while still experimenting with them, as well as kind of, well, I was going to say they tend to be more accessible, but I don't think that's necessarily true. I think literary conservatism can also be radical in its own ways.
I'm sorry. So, but when you're saying literary conservatism, I'm
talking about form,
right?
But
that's not the conservatism you're talking about for the book, right?
For the book, for political and dispositional conservatism is the focus of my book here,
right?
And I mentioned some of Russell Kirk's 5 foundations for conservatism.
Mm-hmm.
The purpose of my book is not to lay out policy guides or anything like that for a Republican administration. And I don't pretend that these novels hit on every main tenet or belief of conservatism. But what I'm talking about, I think you could probably align it with what would be called Reagan conservatism or constitutional conservatism in the American context. But literature that expresses principles about the importance of tradition, the dangers of breaking suddenly from the past, the importance of core institutions and often non-governmental institutions, including the family, the importance of religious belief, even if conservatives don't necessarily have to be conservative, but as William F. Buckley Jr. said, they kind of have to have respect for religion and religious institutions. There's not really much of an economic focus here, but I do discuss through the novel My Antonia by Willa Cather in particular. I write about conservative attitudes towards immigration, and through George Eliot's novel Daniel Deronda, conservative attitudes about national identity. But what you identified is one of the challenges with the timing of my book, which is that conservatism in America is it's especially fluid right now. I don't know if you've noticed that, Jonah.
It's contested.
It's contested.
Yeah.
But I don't. Again, this isn't this is not trying to kind of canonize a particular MAGA understanding of conservatism through the canon, though. Nor do I explicitly, I think, reject any tenets of MAGA specifically, except maybe I think I'm probably too soft on immigration for them. Well, that's a controversial paragraph of the book that is sure to get it thrown out of windows. But I try to bring in a lot of conservative thinkers without losing focus on the fiction itself. So I bring in Roger Scruton, I bring in Buckley, I bring in Jonah Goldberg, I think is his name, a few times.
How hackish.
Yeah. I had to get on the show, Jonah. I figured that was the best way. So I try to bring in parallels between the novels and what, pretty well-known conservative thinkers of the past and present have said.
You must be so bummed that you had all those plugs to Dan Bongino in there, and now he's leaving his podcast.
It's a total waste of time. I do mention Rush Limbaugh, the man Bongino replaced. I have in my chapter about My Antonia and a discussion of conservatism and place. I mention Rush's use of My City Was Gone as his theme song, but the Pretender song.
Yeah.
Because he liked to joke that, he liked the song. It's really catchy, but it is in some ways an unconservative song because it's against economic growth and development, and he kind of liked that juxtaposition.
This is not a particularly conservative song. Is YMCA by the Village People, but we don't need to get into that.
Young Men's Christian Association. So
that's true. That's true.
Don't forget that.
So one thing I didn't hear you mention. So, like, I'm increasingly of the mind that if we're going to talk about in a philosophical bent, in a literary bent, what defines being conservative, or what defines being not conservative, if that's easier, is that it's anti-utopianism, right? Conservatism is fundamentally anti-utopian. Crooked timber of humanity, all that stuff, right? don't immanentize the eschaton, um, and so it's funny. I have this sort of. I'm curious what your take is on this as we elide a bit into pop culture stuff. In some ways, I consider, and this is a radical revision for me, given things I've written and said in the past. I consider like big chunks of the metaphysics of Star Trek to be unconservative, because and then they've tried to deal with the problems that I'm getting at in the future, in the subsequent spinoffs and stuff. But one of the things I think that makes the genre of science fiction generally conservative, small c conservative, is that it's really about human nature, and that human nature doesn't change, right? And so you have far off galaxies, futuristic technology, alien creatures, all of these things, and it turns out that the crooked timber of humanity is still the crooked timber of humanity, and that our even when the narrator is some android, right, or some alien, the way the reader connects with the narrator is by appeals to basic human intuitions and human desires, and those don't change regardless of the technological and material changes. And that's a very conservative insight. There are a lot of people, the one of the books that sort of launched the progressive movement was Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, which was a utopian piece of, basically launched utopian science fiction along with some of the stuff by H.G. Wells. And there was this idea that if you just turned the right dials or added the right chemicals or whatever, you could perfect society through science or through the science of engineering or economics and all those kinds of things. And it seems to me that the great conservative science fiction literature or art, or however you want to put it, says, nah, dog, we'll have faster than light travel, but people will still be fighting for territory. And, even if the chicks are green, dudes are going to be looking to score. And I think that's a very small c conservative insight.
I'm glad you brought that up. And I've got good news for you, is that I write about human nature a lot. The first novel I include, Samuel Johnson's Rasselas, which is arguably not a novel, but close enough for this book. It is very much about a universal human nature. The characters in the novel are African. They're from what was then Abyssinia, now Ethiopia. But he writes about them as if they're Europeans, which is problematic in its own way. But it's the assumption that human nature is consistent across continents. What Johnson focuses on, and I should say across time too, what Johnson focuses on is kind of the constant human longing for something we don't have, and then the brief moment of satisfaction of achieving that before moving into dissatisfaction and restlessness. The character's name Rasselas, it sounds so much like restless, I suspect in part because the novel is in large part about the inherent restlessness of human nature and the different ways we try to satisfy that restlessness, and how it really is kind of impossible to satisfy it. But so much of that novel and that long story, and what Johnson writes in general, he sounds so much like our founders. He was not a huge fan of the American Revolution, but he so often sounds exactly like our founders when he says things like, when he writes about human ambition, and when he writes about how if you look all over the world, you notice certain things. You notice certain human foibles and vices and virtues, but Johnson liked to focus on the vices and shortcomings. And I also write about a Nathaniel Hawthorne novel called The Blythedale Romance, which is a great anti-utopian novel. It's based loosely on his time at a commune where he was basically a socialist farm. And the novel is about the narrator's initial belief that they were going to start a new society. They were going to overturn generations of delusions and false beliefs and ideologies. And he quickly learns that that's just not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because of human nature. And he realizes that they are fools for thinking they can separate themselves from the past. That shows up a little bit in Naipaul too. So many of these novels are anti-utopian in that, well, they take issue with Kamala Harris's catchphrase that we can be unburdened by what has been. It's first of all, it's foolish to think that what has been is necessarily a burden, which is kind of the utopian idea. But no, the conservative understands that we are shaped by what has been, and very often that is a blessing. I obviously, as one of Yuval Levin's underlings, I had to quote him in this book. He writes really well about gratitude, and so I think that as he often says, conservatism is about gratitude, and part of that gratitude is what we have inherited from the past, and so often progressives reject that.
In fairness, though, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I said Russian literature is not American literature, is kind of un-American. One of the nice things about America is, I agree with you, to think that you can completely forget the past is wrong. And we are obviously shaped by the past, but like, America is so much more liberal than certainly Russia, right? In that, in the sense of the whole American project is about throwing off, the dead weight of the past. Sometimes too much, right? Because some of that past. Some people think that this gets into the sort of conflict division stuff, right? The progressive mindset sees us as blank slates, and therefore all problems with society are social fiction, socially contrived, social, institutional things. And the conservative says, no, some of that stuff comes from the fact that human nature is real, and you need institutions that channel human nature in a positive way. And so a lot of progressive stuff says that if you just throw off the past, the problems of human nature go away, when in fact, like, a big part of the past is overcoming the problems with human nature, and you need the acquired knowledge of the past to do it. And I think that's a different kind of tension. But like a lot of, the American Western, all of those kinds of things are very much about how I left all that citified stuff behind me. And that's one of the things I think that makes American culture so different than European culture.
But in the Western, the people, this isn't disputing your point, but
you're allowed to dispute my point.
Okay, well, I'll get to that later.
I paid for this mic, Mr. Scalia, but still, go on.
But even in the Western, they leave, but they leave the city, but they go on to build new cities, right?
Right.
And they find that we talked about Paul Cantor last time I was on, and I think what he says about Westerns here is right. That what the Western shows is that a lot of the people who help you form the city cannot actually run the city once it's there. Which I don't know if that falls under the umbrella of human nature or
no, but that's very much
change.
The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance,
exactly.
Right? Like you need the John Wayne guy, and then he needs to get out of the way for civilization to set itself up.
And I think conservatism, as it appears in these novels, obviously does not reject change. Conservatives understand change. I mean, obviously Burke recognized it as much in the French Revolution. The problem is how that change comes about, whether the change is connected and grounded in a culture's and a people's traditions, and that it's gradual and organic rather than sudden, drastic, and very often top down.
Right.
But you mentioned immanentize the eschaton, but I discussed that phrase specifically in relation to the Blythedale romance, because that is very much what the characters in that novel want to do. And it's interesting. The villain of that novel is he has a competing idealistic worldview. He does not want to start a a farming commune. He wants to institute prison reform. He thinks that convicts need more rehabilitation, and the narrator presents him as a great villain. Why is this guy a great villain? His cause seems pretty good, but you realize that he's a villain because that's all he believes in. He's a monomaniac. He's basically Ahab. Everything he does is about that single cause. His whole relationship with everybody in this commune is based on their loyalty to that cause. And if they don't support him in that cause, he says, "You're not really my friend." And so that's another. I think that's kind of an emblem of the dangers of ideology and monomania there.
Yeah, no, that's that's. I often tell people one of the things I like about conservatism, rightly understood, is that it's a partial philosophy of life.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that like there isn't conservatism in literature or in religion or any of those kinds of things. But political conservatism doesn't necessarily speak to a lot of that stuff.
Yeah. So would you agree with Russell Kirk's statement that conservatism is anti-ideological? Does that sound right to you?
He used to quote this guy H. Stuart Hughes, who would say conservatism is the negation of ideology.
Yeah.
I am pretty passionately committed against that argument. I write a lot about it in my underrated second book. If
the tyranny of cliches for listeners who are curious.
Well, terrible title. And
it's no 13 novels conservatives will love, but
true. But what books are? Yeah. So look, the only place I'll revise and extend my marks on that, because I've been thinking a lot about this, is it really depends what you mean by ideology, right? Eric von Knut-Ledeen, who I'm a big fan of, he makes the point that all an ideology is a worldview. It's and in fact, if you look in the most dictionaries, at least back when he was writing, ideology and worldview were synonymous terms. And I think it is sort of crazy and unconservative to think that you can walk out into the world around us without a theory of the case about how things work, about how things should work, about what principles and values you should privilege over others, where are the trade-offs and how do you make them, and all these kinds of things. And so the argument I would make is that what makes conservatism up until, let's say, 2015 different than American progressivism or pragmatism is precisely that it's not that. So like pragmatism from William James and John Dewey and those guys and Walter Lippmann, they introduce it as non-ideological.
Yeah.
And it was profoundly ideological, but its great shtick was pretending that it wasn't ideological at all. And so it was a very useful form of hey, we're just following the science, right? That was basically we're disinterested public servants. We're just going where the data takes us and all that kind of stuff. And the reason why I've long argued that I think conservative ideology is preferable is that one of is a sociological point, is that conservatives acknowledge their priors. We're aware of them. We wear them on our ties, right? Like I got my Adam Smith tie, I got my Ed Burke tie, right? And so because it is impossible to rid yourself of your biases and your priors, the only responsible and adult and mature thing to do if you want to engage the world or engage politics or engage life is to be aware of them, acknowledge them, and be on guard for where they may lead you wrong. And so in that sense, I've long argued ideology is just a checklist. It's like, okay, I value freedom over anti-freedom, right? And so when in doubt, I'm going to lean towards freedom. I think I start from an assumption that markets work better than state planning. But if you want to come up with a counterexample, because there are exceptions to every rule that says in this instance, state planning is better, make your case, right? And So in that sense, I think Kirk is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The flip side to that is that it depends. Again, it depends what you mean by ideology. If by ideology you mean, or what you mean by conservatism, if by ideology you mean if you mean monomania,
Yeah.
right? Or if you're like Colonel Nicholson in A Bridge on the River Kwai, who thinks everything has to take a backseat to getting that bridge built until he realizes how stupid that is, right? If you think free markets are the answer to everything, and you will not, if you have epistemic closure, right? If it is Jacobin thinking, that kind of stuff, which I tend to think of as more as categorical thinking than ideological thinking,
Yeah.
then it's bad, right? Because the whole point of small c conservatism, the conservative temperament thing, conservative sensibility thing, is to be skeptical about sweeping ideas.
Yeah.
And I think, the point Yuval and I have talked about, the essence of Burke's thought is a simple heuristic. It's a simple rule, which says any principle taken too far hits the point of diminishing returns and becomes counterproductive, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's one of the things I always liked about conservatism. Conservatives, we have these huge arguments about the trade-offs between liberty and order, freedom and virtue. We'd understand that at some point, one good thing comes at the expense of another good thing, and so we would have arguments about where to draw lines. The whole progressive worldview, and I know I'm monologizing, as John Podhoretz would say it, but the progressive point of view says no, all good things can go together.
Yeah.
Right. It's what Samuel Huntington called the unity of goodness. That you can spend more on education and defense and save money, and taxes are a dessert topping and a floor wax, and there's no problem with all that kind of stuff. And I'm much more of a Tom Sowell guy who says, no, everything's about trade-offs.
Yeah, I'm a little annoyed you beat me to the Thomas Sowell quotation, because I mentioned that a few times in the book, and that is, there's a conservative recognition that there, as he says, there are no solutions, only trade-offs.
Right.
And that's part of the recognition of our understanding of human nature. Human nature is imperfect. We are fallen, and so what we do is imperfect. And that part of that is we often have to make compromises and recognize the trade-offs in the policies we institute and how we apply some of our beliefs.
All right, you are free to go full Tevi Troy on me and drag back references to your books wherever you see appropriate.
No, Jonah, before we leave, I want to. This is a part of. I want to talk about a part of my book that I think you will disagree with.
Okay.
And I mention you.
Dogs are bad.
I include the novel "Kill All the Dogs." No, Daniel Deronda by George Eliot is about nationalism. And in part, it's a Zionist novel. It's about the creation of a Jewish state. It's remarkable because it was 20 years before the first Zionist conference, and Eliot wasn't Jewish, but it's still a pro-Zionist novel, or just Zionist novel. But it's also about the national identities of European nations.
Mm-hmm.
And she very subtly, it's wonderfully done, she very subtly argues about the need for European nations to maintain their very distinctive national identities. And she makes the case for Israel by comparing it to other comparing Jews to other peoples around the world, and specifically Europe, who have been able to establish their own politics, celebrate their own past. And her concern with Europe is that Jews aren't the only ones losing their distinctive identity. So are the English. She focuses on the English because most of the novel is set there. And so she talks about something called separateness with communication. She applies it mostly to the Jews, but I think it's applicable to all nations, which is this understanding that in some regards, you have to maintain a separateness from other people but you must also communicate with them, engage with them. It's if you want to go back to trade-offs or balancing, it's something along those lines. And I thought about I think in your arguments about nationalism, I probably side more with Ramesh and Rich Lowry, in that, as I understand your argument against nationalism, your concern is that it necessarily devolves into the elevation of a particular person. And I think there's plenty of evidence for that. But I wonder if American nationalism is different, because if nationalism is an expression of a specific country's people's identity, because America is not grounded in a single individual at its start, like no foundational monarch, for example, American nationalism, properly understood, will not necessarily fall into that same trap. Now, I don't argue all of this in the book. I tiptoe around it a little bit, but that's what I was thinking of when I was kind of trying to engage with your argument against nationalism.
Okay, so I mean, this could be the subject of a whole other podcast, but
yeah,
and I know you want to talk about Severance, but if memory serves, Ramesh and Rich, dear friends who I respect a lot, make many fun points. The word benign,
benign nationalism
does a lot of work for them, right? And like, benign is just a fancy way of saying good, right? There are very few terms out there that I think are problematic, where you aren't sort of question begging or stealing a base if you shove good in front of it.
Yeah.
Right. And so, if all we're ever talking about is good nationalism, that's great. Fine. Okay. But like, the problem is that not all nationalism is good, and the logic of nationalism often leads to bad things. And, the first person I ever heard say that America wasn't nationalist, it was patriotic, was Michael Ledeen back in the 90s when he worked at AEI, and he was a student of European fascism, particularly Italian fascism. And it's always stuck with me. I don't think Michael and I see eye to eye on a lot of things these days, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and Rich and I have argued about this quite a bit, right?
Yeah.
So, like, one of the things that Rich will say is, well, your distinction between patriotism and nationalism is fake, because patriotism basically comes from patria, the fatherland, and basically it meant nationalism when it was perfectly fine. If we were going to have if the entire argument rested on etymological and lexicological nicitudes, he wins. But I don't think that's right, because whatever word we're going to have for it, the concepts that I'm getting at are different. And so, first of all, I think you would agree, like, ethno-nationalism in America is a problem.
Yes.
Right?
I agree.
So that's one of the things you get into with European nationalism, is that most of them are ethno-nationalist.
Yes.
I guess I'm the only person who thinks this is fascinating, because I keep bringing it up and people keep yawning at me. But like, I think it is fascinating how German nationalism begins as linguistic nationalism, and the biological ethno-racial stuff doesn't come till much later. And I think that's one of the things that's really important for people to understand about the power that language has in messing with people's heads. So ethno-nationalism is not benign nationalism, at least in the American context. It's in fact contradictory to the American context, right? To say that, when you hear people say, oh, their nationalism is only for white Christians, it's like, well, that doesn't work for me, right? Or white Protestant Christians, that doesn't work for me. And so my standard answer about all of this is that, much like Burke, right, where all principles can be taken too far, I'm very sympathetic to Roger Scruton's stuff about how a little nationalism is healthy and good, right? And the analogy I always use is like salt. If you know anything about cooking, if you have no salt in your food, it's bland. The different ingredients just kind of don't mesh together, right? A little salt brings all the flavors together and makes them pop and makes them all come together.
Mm-hmm.
A little too much salt starts to ruin the dish. Way too much salt absolutely ruins this, and way, way, way too much salt is literally toxic. That's how I feel about nationalism, is that we need a little nationalism, a little rah-rah team spirit, right? A little sort of solidarity for my fellow Americans versus total strangers. I'm not a Diogenes citizen of the world guy.
Yeah.
But so I have zero problem with a lot of the stuff that you're talking about. I have not read, the Eliot piece, but I think
it's only 800 pages, Jonah.
Oh, there you go.
Polish it off on a weekend.
I'll have it read by noon. No, but so ethnic identity, I got no problem with. Ethnic pride, I got no problem with. Zionism, I got no problem with. But I think a lot of the nationalists steal some bases because a lot of what they're talking about is nationism. I believe in nations, right? And as a sort of subsidiarity federalism for the world. I think those should be the sovereign units that the world is organized around, and that we're never going to have a Tennyson Parliament of Man kind of thing. And I have no problem with ethnic, what Jimmy Carter called ethnic purity. I have no problem with ethnic communities, bounded communities, shared traditions, of little Italies and little Warsaws and black and Harlem or whatever. All that stuff is fine as long as you have the right to exit.
Yeah.
And part of the so anyway, to get back to the central point here, my major problem with nationalism in arguments about political organization is they have no limiting principle.
Yeah.
And that's very unconservative. It is backdoor utopian. And just as a matter of history, I talked to Sinan Dumé. I can never remember how to pronounce his name.
Yeah.
Our colleague about this a while back. But nationalism and socialism as historical movements are kindred and often interchangeable movements. And that is something that conservatives should at least be, aware of. Meanwhile, so the most patriotic holiday in America is the 4th of July. It's where we signed a friggin' document, right, that laid out a bunch of principles, right? That's very patriotic in the sense that what I'm talking about is a commitment to a series of principles. This very Calvin Coolidge sort of notion of one with the law on their side is a majority, that man who shot Liberty Valance idea that the hero in the American political tradition is the man who stands up to the mob, not the mob. I see nationalism as the philosophy of the mob. And our most nationalistic holiday, which is actually my favorite holiday, is Thanksgiving. Because it's about a relationship, a covenant with God and soil and family, and actually predates the founding.
Yeah.
But Thanksgiving, loving Thanksgiving, isn't going to lead to invading Poland, because it's just a pinch of salt. It's not the whole thing, and it's contained. And anyway, so I apologize, but thank you for the opportunity to monologize again.
No, it's I thought you wouldn't have a problem opening up about that. But just to close that, Thanksgiving is also the most excessive holiday. if you're worried about nationalism as the excesses of nationalism, Thanksgiving represents that, because the whole point is you eat too much, feel disgusting, and fall asleep watching a football game.
I know, but isn't Christmas more excessive in the sense that it's much more commercial?
It's more
can't
commercial,
figure out when to stop buying presents, and you have demand avariciously more and more presents.
I don't think the excess is baked in the same way, and I think there's also a sense of guilt about the excess in a way that with Thanksgiving, the excess is more of the point. But you're right. There is something excessive about Christmas a lot of the time.
I like wallowing in my own crapulence on Thanksgiving, as Mr. Burns would say in The Simpsons. All right, so briefly, you have views. So I tweeted something about Severance, which put in mind to you that we should talk about it. And since you're also a pop culture guy, not just a George Eliot, fancy pants Tweety seminar guy. Thoughts?
First of all, your tweet was that you were concerned that it was becoming it had a lost problem, meaning it didn't know where it was going. Great first season, great premise, gripping, but the second season is much less engaging. It doesn't have as clear a sense of where it's going. I was talking to a colleague yesterday who pointed out that the pacing is off, and I think that's exactly right. This season, I think we're like 8 episodes in,
Something
7
like
or
that.
8,
Yeah.
but it feels like we've only gone through 4. It's somehow a forgettable season. By the way, you saw that Ben Stiller, the director and writer of this show, replied to you. Did you see that?
I didn't see it. My wife told me,
Yeah.
which was so. It's interesting. We used to be kind of Twitter friends, and we would DM every now and then.
Oh, really?
And then he grew up like a block from me, and we're
yeah.
about the same age. And so I came this close to being able to land him on the podcast. And and then in a moment of irresponsibility, I joined in a Twitter pylon on what's the female star of Patricia Arquette, who had tweeted something really dumb. I can't remember what it was, but it was something like, this is outrageous. We should kick Ukraine out of NATO or something like that. And no, this is outrageous. We should kick Russia out of NATO.
Yeah.
And everyone dunked on her. And I did something too.
That too.
And he's very close friends with her, and he came to her defense, and he got very mad at me for doing that. And he unfollowed me at the time, and maybe he follows me again. So, but like, I'm a huge Ben Stiller fan. And so anyway, I had not seen that he had responded, but I'm not reading a lot of my replies these days because a lot of jackwads and goobers are saying stupid things, and I just cannot let them get that much of my headspace. So,
well, he just said that I guess I'll have to watch Lost now.
Yeah.
But I think your point is right. The Severance, for anybody who hasn't seen the show, it's kind of a dystopian show about a mysterious office. We don't really know what goes on at this office, but it seems to be connected to a cult. But there's kind of a department of this office that is that employs people who work there from 9 to 5, but because there's a chip implanted in their brain, the employee version of themselves are totally different from their non-working selves. So when they're outside of the office, they don't know what they do at the office. When they're in the office, they don't know that they have a family. If they have a family, they don't know who they are. And their office selves are called innies. The out-of-office selves are called outies. And I describe it as kind of like a Radiohead song if it were a TV show. It's bleak, it's repetitive, but it's dystopian, but it's gripping, or especially in the first season. And initially, it was kind of funny because you think about this, and you're saying, well, so basically, I can go to work, and when I'm at work, I don't have to worry about anything but work. But when I go home, I don't have to bring any work home. I don't think about work. I don't have to talk to anybody from work. It's just my life outside of work. That sounds like a pretty great deal. But the show develops and shows, kind of illustrates and demonstrates all the problems with this, not the least of which is just, we don't know what their job is, and they don't know what their job is. They're just kind of moving numbers on a computer screen and putting them into buckets. But I think what's been interesting the last couple of episodes is it's become more. It's always been about identity, but it's become more and more about identity. In that, if you have these two, if you don't remember what you're doing half the day, are you the same person in those different parts of the day? And I think most people would say yes, you are. But what's happened the last couple of episodes is that we're seeing the innies become jealous of the lives that their outies live, and vice versa. So in one episode, an innie sleeps with one of his colleagues, but spoiler alert, the colleague is only pretending to be her innie version. She's actually just still the outie.
Right.
And when the man, this is Scott Adams' character. That's his name, right?
I think so. Yeah.
Adam Scott.
Adam Scott.
Is Dilbert. When he realizes what's happened, he tells the innie version of the girl, "I slept with your outie self," and the innie gets jealous, and gets mad at her outie. And it becomes kind of this master-servant relationship between the outies and the innies. And in another plot line, the spouse of an outie is jealous of the innie version of his husband because he suspects he's had an affair. But it's just all, it's weird. It's fascinating. But I do agree that I don't think it knows where it's going.
Yeah, so like I like some of that stuff. I'm interested in some of it. I have my own weird, complex views these days about identity stuff. But my base, just to be clear, what I mean by the Lost problem, I think Lost itself was kind of an ironic title because I think the writers got lost, and they projected that onto the screen. My former AEI amanuensis Jack Butler and our colleague Jim Pethokoukis are two of America's foremost lost defenders, and they are what social scientists call wrong. But Lost was really compelling, right? It pulled you along, but then it turned out to be just a massive con.
Yeah.
Because there was no way, given all the red herrings, all the Russian and the Pine Barrens kind of stuff, that they were going to be able to stick a landing to explain everything in a satisfactory way. And there's something about that I really hate in pop culture. This is another spoiler alert thing. If you've never seen the Tim Robbins movie Jacob's Ladder, it's really cool for the first like half of it because you think he is being visited by demons and all these kinds of things, and he sees all these things, and you're like, what's really going on? And then it turns out he's got PTSD and he's imagining it all. And you're like, come on, it's just so. That's why I hate dream sequences. One of my big rules is once writers start depending on dream sequences or featuring any acting troops, you know that they have crossed the line into self-indulgence. And so
that's why I think Pulp Fiction, Fight Club is overrated. The twist in Fight Club is a total cop-out.
Yeah.
I will. The one dream sequence worth defending is Newhart, the second Newhart.
Yes, I agree with that.
That's the exception.
But like, it's the point of it is that it is fantastic if you are developing all these outlandish kind of what the hell's going on kind of things, so long as when you stick the landing, you stick it. And if it turns out that it was just sort of this, haha, made you watch kind of thing, it's going to color the entire thing in a different way. It's like, my obsession with Battlestar Galactica is the first 2 seasons, they kept telling us in the opening credits, the Cylons had a plan. And then it turned out whatever plan the Cylons had, the writers had no friggin' plan. And so like one of the only, like, I'm curious what you think. I actually wrote a cover story for National Review about this years ago. I thought Breaking Bad was the best television show ever made because it was a novel that had a beginning, a middle, and the end, and it completely stuck the landing. You may have not liked the actual ending, but like the transformation of this character over time pulled you along and was plausible in ways that like are really, really, really hard. You make a case that Better Call Saul is better because to make a prequel that is consistent with all of that is even harder. But anyway,
Better Call Saul is excellent, but too slow.
I agree, it's a little too slow.
But my wife and I have resolved to rewatch it. I rewatched Breaking Bad a couple years ago, and I think you're right. It's better than The Sopranos even because The Soprano had too many dream sequences. The Sopranos was a little less consistent, like the whole Steve Buscemi subplot. Breaking Bad is, I think, as close to perfect as you can get. It stuck the landing perfectly, and it learned from The Sopranos. People were so annoyed by The Sopranos ending because Chase, it was like he didn't want to give viewers what they wanted. He wanted to frustrate them. Breaking Bad this finale wasn't quite fan service, but it understood. Viewers have been with the show for several years. They've invested a lot of time. Give them a satisfying ending. So I think the Breaking Bad ending was perfect for that reason. Everything fit together. in a way that's pretty rare.
So it's funny. My daughter tells me that a lot of young, ambitious men, they just see, God, my mind is blanking on the title character's name in Breaking Bad.
Walter White.
They see Walter White as just a hero.
Yeah.
Right. Not a tragic hero.
Yeah.
Just like, a hero. And I think that's, that's, so, I mean, like, I'm kind of curious, like, is this a new thing, or is this as old as like Dracula, where bad guys, if they're charismatic bad guys, because I read a lot of this in Suicide of the West, where like we have this very romantic view of the Byronic hero, right? And so there are a lot of evil heroes in popular culture these days. Dexter is probably the premier example, right? He's literally a serial killer who mostly, but not entirely, kills only other serial killers. He kills other serial killers and people who might expose the fact that he's a serial killer, which is like kind of negates whatever vigilante good he does, right? Hannibal Lecter became kind of like this heroic figure.
Yeah.
In The Wire, what's his name? Omar, was, basically a Robin Hood figure. And
President Obama said Omar was the best character of The Wire, which is a terrible answer for a president to give.
Agreed.
Bubbles is the answer that a president should give.
That's exactly right.
No, I think, the Byronic hero is a great example because, Byron didn't really invent the Byronic hero. I would argue my boy Walter Scott did a few years before, but basically a dark, brooding, very troubled figure is the central character, deeply imperfect, but generally doing good. Tony Soprano is not doing good, and Walt White is not doing good. They are, yet you often root for them. It's funny you mentioned that about younger people thinking Walt White is the hero, because I was defending Walter White to my nephew who's in his mid-20s, and I said, no, I think that the genius of that show is you root for him, and you even root for Tony Soprano, even though you know they're villains. You know what they're doing is not good, but you're invested in them.
Right.
So you want him to beat the neo-Nazis, if only because he's less disgusting than the neo-Nazis at the end. I mean, even somebody like Achilles, going back a couple years, he is deeply flawed, and an imperfect figure. And maybe you don't root for him, but I think many readers do root for him, and he's an emblem of heroism in many ways.
I mean, we're doing a lot of spoilers here, but I always thought that, there's the scene where Jesse's girlfriend is choking on her own vomit from taking heroin, and Walter White decides not to just turn her over and save her life and lets her die a bad death. I think that was basically Vince Gilligan, the creator of Breaking Bad's attempt to say, "You stupid schmucks, he's a bad guy now."
Yeah.
And just shove it down their faces, and people just, well, you got to do that. She was gonna break up the band,
She was bad.
She was Yoko Ono. She was Yoko Ono of the drug dealing operation.
No, she got Jesse back into drugs. So, arguably, by letting her die, he saved Jesse. So, we were talking about trade-offs earlier, Jonah. I mean, this is a great example. No, and remember what happens with that. It wasn't just another conservative theme, unintended consequences.
Right.
She dies, he lets her die, and then that leads to the plane crash because her father is the air traffic controller who's grieving over her death, not paying attention on the job, and lets two planes collide.
Although I have it on good authority that plane crash actually was caused by DEI. So I wrote about this a long time ago. You ever see the movie Simple Plan?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Good movie.
See, that to me is like, if you want to talk about the Russell Kirkian kind of conservatism, right? Or even a Hayekian kind of conservatism, where it's all the moral codes are basically Chesterton's fence.
Yeah.
and you should observe them even if you don't know why they exist, right? And so here's a simple plan, right? That's the genius of the title, right? We're going to make a whole bunch of money because we found this money in the woods. It doesn't belong to anybody, and we'll just have it, and it'll all work out great. And of course, this main character who's on basically the decent bourgeois conservative path of work hard and play by the rules, he says, what's the harm in deviating from that? And it turns out that, like, just 5 feet off the path of living a decent and proper and ethical life leads to all sorts of horrible mayhem. And it's a very conservative message. It's just not billed as conservative. And I think that's one of the things, I think, if we're going to talk about conservative, getting back to conservatism, at least in popular culture, and it's a very Paul Cantor kind of point, is that the deeper conservatism or the deeper patriotism or the deeper utopia, all these kinds of things in really good films and movies, and I think obviously in books, it doesn't have a partisan ideological valence to it, but it does speak to a broader point about a broader tendency of our cultures, right? And I love that he thinks that, like, The Walking Dead is a perfect example of American can-do spirit. But he's got a kind of a point.
His love for I think we've talked about this. His love for the X-Files kind of baffles us both. But The Wire is a great example too of going back to unintended consequences. That was not intended to be a conservative show by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
But I think one of the reasons conservatives liked it is because they saw it, especially with Stringer Bell's attempts to get a permit for his business, just how sclerotic a city government could be, and how it actually inhibits progress and development and prosperity through all the red tape and hoops people have to jump through, and what other cliches you want to use there.
Wire fans used to get furious at me when I would make this point about it being a conservative, small C conservative show. Oh, the creator's a Marxist. You don't know what you're talking about. And it's like, there's like literally not a Republican in that show, right? Except like, off stage, the governor, who doesn't show up until like the 5th season. Meanwhile, the villain is modern urban liberalism, right? It is, a very liberal city, and unions and Democratic controlled Democratic and union controlled place. And although we're supposed to be very sympathetic to the unions,
unions are good now, despite the last 60 years of its track record. They're actually great.
But the sort of bureaucratic, institutionalized urban liberalism of the show is like what's being indicted there. It's not, modern industrial capitalism that's being indicted there. In fact, the hero of the show was a big Adam Smith fan, right? I mean, that's what Stringer Bell, they find in his house, is he's like, really,
that's right.
He has a theory, he has a wealth of nations there. All right, my friend, we've gone long, but this was fun. We should have you back.
I would love it. So my book it's 13 novels conservatives will love, but probably haven't read. It's going to be out in May, maybe early June. Still trying to figure that out. But
you could probably pre-order now.
You can pre-order it now, absolutely, and hopefully get it in time for your dad or your grad.
Summer reading is coming, people. This is a great thing to get. And the podcast is called Back of the Book, and you can find it wherever great podcasts are beamed out
away
through strings and tin cans or whatever.
I was very proud of that title, Jonah, but then somebody reminded me, but that Back of the Book was a Bill O'Reilly segment.
Was it really?
Yeah. It was his culture segment at the end of some episodes.
I always have associated with the New Republic. And then
I know the term from friends at the Weekly Standard who called,
who got it from the New Republic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think we use the term about it at NR, but I just always associated that. I assumed that we kind of got it from TNR, but maybe we didn't. I don't know.
It may be broader than that. I'm not sure.
Maybe when Whittaker Chambers was doing book reviews in the back of Time magazine, it was called The Back of the Book. I don't know. Yeah. If only one of us had access to a research assistant who could look up the etymology of Back of the Book. All right. Chris,
great talking to you, Jonah.
Thank you for doing this. And of course, we'll have you back.